Well, hello and welcome once again into the Map Room, the podcast where we try and use our own business experience and the experience of our guests to help you maybe make better decisions and get better outcomes for your business. Well, today we are lifting the lid or maybe going under the bonnet of employee ownership. I think you can't see a PR story at the moment without employee ownership and employee ownership trust being prevalent. It might be because we know of many PR businesses that have done this themselves, and if they can't do their own PR, who can? But I just think it's something which I'll say gains some momentum, and I think it's worthwhile a discussion today to see whether this is an option for you in your business, or it's something that you can learn, understand a bit more about, even if it's just to discount it. So maybe to put some context in, I think for years, I think the only one I would have known about would have been John Lewis. And I did some research recently, it quite surprised me. And it said that there were fewer than 20 owner-employed businesses before 2014. But in the last 10 years, in 2024 alone, there was 560 transitions into employee ownership. So I just think that shows you where we are. And in fact, now in the UK, there's just over 2,500 employee-owned business. So again, it's a question of whether this is an option for you. So as per normal, we bring our subject matter expert in, and it's an interesting one today because it's Paul Barnes. And the reason for that is, for some of you who may already know, Paul has led his own transition to employee ownership just in March last month. And therefore, I think it's an ideal perspective to get Paul into the Map Room and help you understand what it was for Map, why it was right for Paul, and again, give you that reach out if that's something for yourself. So I should just say, like I do to every guest, Paul, welcome and thank you for giving your time for the Map Room.
Thank you, Stuart.
How are you?
I'm all right, thank you, yeah.
Apart from what's life like being the new employee, salaried employee after 13 years? That's got to be strange.
It is strange. I think when you first announce it to your team is the strangest part. It's like that old saying that everything changes and nothing changes at the same time. You'll never get your company back again. Once you've transitioned to employee ownership, it's not yours and it'll never be yours again. So that's weird when you're the founder, especially when you just continue working in there and nothing changes operationally afterwards. It's quite a strange one to get your head around, but I've had a bit of time now to reflect and sort of process it, and the team have been asking lots of questions and actually getting quite excited. Not that I think they need to get overly excited. We'll come on to that maybe a little bit later, but it does help, I think, with your mindset a little bit to see that big point of doing this is to reward other people and for the benefit of other people, not just for yourself. So that's been nice, but yeah, strange in some ways and very little change in other ways.
Well, let's go back to some basics then, Paul. So for those who don't know, obviously we've just gone through our own, and I know we've helped clients previously go through this, but what is an employee ownership trust, or shortened to an EOT?
It's a form of exit strategy, effectively. So it helps the founders to transact an exit for them out of the business. Effectively, it's a special trust buys the controlling shares of the business and holds them on behalf of the employees. So it's quite a strange one, and it requires a lot of thought. I think a lot of the headlines try to grab you that it's, the best thing ever and everybody should do it, which is definitely not the case, and something we're passionate about helping clients to work out whether it's right for them. But what it means for the team is they don't buy in. So the team don't directly become shareholders. They become beneficiaries of a trust that is ultimately the shareholder of the company. So unlike most MBOs, but I'll come on to this after, how it can be very similar to MBO. Most MBOs involve somebody putting the hand in the pocket, often debt finance from the bank. There's nothing like that. The way that the founders get paid, or the former shareholders get paid, is usually by form of cash that's currently on the balance sheet and then future profits of the business. Because the trust holds the shares of the business on behalf of the employees hopefully eventually get to share in the profits of the business once the shareholders have been paid off. One of the leading, if you like, drivers of it, if you think, one of the things that attracted me and attracts a lot of others is the company stays independent. So too many of us have seen transactions where a lot of money might have been involved, but actually the founder has seen that the thing that they worked very hard to create dissipate very quickly. The culture changed. Maybe employees let go. The brand changed to be unrecognisable, the proposition and the delivery from what it was previously. So yeah, one of the softer sides, if you like, of employee ownership is maintaining that culture and that legacy.
I think I think that's a very important thing. I know it's an important thing for you, Paul, and I'm sure it's an important thing for lots of founders, and I think we'll come on to that. So essentially what you're saying there is because it is a trust, which is no different to those people who may have looked at trust funds for potentially inheritance purposes, is the trust is an entity in itself, the same as a company is an entity in itself, and instead of having shareholders, the shareholders are the trust, but employees who come in and out are beneficiaries of that.
Yeah, it's a good point that actually, in terms of the vehicle, just to clarify this, because sometimes you'll see an EOT transaction where there is a limited company entity involved, a new limited company is created, and sometimes there's not. So there's always a trust created, and the trust ultimately holds the shares on behalf of the beneficiaries. But sometimes a limited company is created as well, and it was in this case. The two main reasons for that is, one, it's easier to transition trustees in and out. So if those trustees leave the company or no longer want to be trustees, you just change who the shareholders of the limited company are, as opposed to if the trustees were the shareholders of the trading entity, then every time they leave, you're having to recreate the trustees. So there's just one trustee of MAP, and it's MAP Trustees Limited. But then there are directors of that trustee limited company who then also benefit from limited liability by being directors of a limited company. So they get some protection as well.
Interesting. I think we'll come on to the sort of transactional side of it maybe later, because if it is something that people are interested in looking at further, then it's important to help share our experience of how the transaction works, and as you say, maybe explaining why you took certain decisions for yourself, and obviously for the team. We have been talking about this for a period of time, and there's always a question of whether it's the right time, etc. And again, I think we'll come on to that in terms of the right time for Matt. But what's your view on why these have become so popular in the last few years?
Employee ownership has existed for ages, but the real game changer was in 2014 when the UK government decided that they wanted more businesses to become employee owned because they saw that they performed well, they were more resilient, therefore crudely paid more tax, etc., etc. So they encouraged that through tax breaks. So for a long time, an EOT transaction has been completely free of capital gains tax. Capital gains tax is what you would normally pay on selling shares in a company, but that became an exempt transaction. No tax payable at all on the proceeds that you receive on sale of your shares to an EOT.
Do you think that research I looked at was 560 transitions that year alone? We often talk about exit, and we work with clients around exit planning workshops and things like that. But we're always very honest to say to people, look, maybe having all your eggs in one basket is not the right thing to do, because only such a small percentage of small business transactions go through. Do you think this is around the government trying to find an incentive like they would do with maybe reduced stamp duty to lift the housing market? Was this about trying to get more small business transactions achieved?
It's a strange one, because in a normal transaction, they will make they will make money from the tax on the CGT, and they don't make that here. But what they believe for a period of time is that by becoming employee owned, you're more likely to perform well because the employees are more invested in the company, and performing well as a company means potentially more corporation tax, but that might be somewhat eroded by the employee bonuses that we're going to talk about. But it would usually mean more VAT. They had this theory that when they looked at the data, and this is what a lot of employee ownership advocates like to use. Remember, I'm not an employee advocate. I've just felt that it was the right thing for me. So I look at this on a very balanced way. But what they would point to was that the data was saying that, hang on, a lot of these businesses that have become employee owned are performing really well. Now, the skeptic in me thinks, well, is it just that good companies were becoming employee owned rather than became good because they were employee owned after the effect? So I think since this tax break's come in, more businesses have gone after it, and they've probably looked at the data again and thought, oh, maybe we were wrong, or maybe that's no longer the case. And they need to create tax receipts from somewhere anyway. So they hit it last autumn. So now only 50% of the gain will be tax-free and the other 50% will be taxed.
So again, just for clarity, so what we're saying is when these were first became popular, 100% tax relief, capital gains tax, but since the October budget of 2025, 50% of that is now due. Whichever way you look at it, half full, half empty, it's still 50% relief, but tax is now due on the gain, on the capital gain for the sellers.
That's right, yeah. So it's still more tax effective than selling to a third party, but not as tax effective as it was. And that was immediate last October. So those transactions that are going through at the moment, it's not the usual thing where if you complete before 5th of April, you'll beat the new tax rules. It was an immediate change that day. So I think that's one of the reasons it's become more popular. The other one is because the John Lewis story has become more and more published and more people have become aware of that. Yeah. There are a couple of other ones as well. So Aardman Animations, who are the creators of Wallace and Gromit, they did it.
Yeah.
Richer Sounds, they did it as well. So they've definitely been in the headlines more. Other reasons, one I talked about before, is that no one has to find cash. No one has to put money in the pocket. So it's what I call vendor initiated. You're creating your own deal effectively. You don't have to find the person who's willing to pay for it because the payments are out of future profits. So that's another one. And then a big one is just, as I said before, about the culture, maintaining the culture. And the other one that you've talked about a lot, and we've talked about a lot on the podcast, is the stress of a transaction and the timeline involved and how things drag on and the negotiation phase, and it becomes really stressful and long-winded. Well, actually, you can control a lot of that with an EOT transaction. It's people who know each other working together to create a transaction that everyone benefits from.
I think that's a really important takeaway from this, Paul. Having gone through it with you recently, I think the point of very often, we've spoke on the podcast before, and we've had Leanne speak before about the concept of deal fatigue. We've both experienced it in our business life. But the point that you always think sometimes is everybody really pushing for this transaction, whereas you say, I think the hidden beauty, if that's the right phrase of this, is it's not something that is looked at over and over and over again. We have, and we know of clients who have had numerous offers and numerous due diligences done only to not get this thing completed. So I think there is a time and a stress and an impact on the business benefit that's really worth people understanding. You mentioned the obvious one about, do good companies become employee owned? I think that's very much to do with the culture that's driven, and the fact that we know where we have seen, and we've had on this podcast, we've had guests talk about where they felt that some of the culture they had created had been either disappeared or in some cases cut to pieces by an acquirer. So we know that by going through this route, that's a benefit of that. But it also got to me thinking that if we look at not just culture, let's look at things like succession planning, because that's something, isn't it, which very often where we've seen exits in the past and where you and I have been involved in our own exits, it literally is, thank you, Mr. Brown, thank you, Mr. Barnes, you can now exit stage left. There hasn't been, for yourself and I, earn-outs, and we know that's sometimes the case with others. But this is a point, isn't it, of there is again, I'm going to use the phrase hidden beauty. There is a benefit of saying, do you know what? We can see a need for succession. We can see a pathway to succession, but it's not something that has to be done to make the transaction happen. And it doesn't have to be done in the first 1, 2, 3, however many years. I think that's something which people don't fully understand.
Yeah, so really interesting. I think what it does, I see it as like one foot out of the door. And what I mean by that is I've talked before on the podcast about you literally do two roles as a business owner of a limited company. You're a shareholder and you're a director. I'm no longer a shareholder now. So at the time where I feel it's right for me to transition myself out of being the managing director of the business, I'm not shackled, for want of a better word, of how do I deal with the ownership of this company? Because I feel very passionate that for a small business owner or a small business, everybody who's got equity in that business should be giving value to it proportionately. Obviously, if somebody's got 1 or 2% minority, they might provide a chairman role, consultancy role, but it's not right, I don't think, to be holding the lion's share of the business and owning the lion's share of the business, and you're no longer participating in the company. That would make me feel very uncomfortable. So this has enabled me to have one step to actually, I'm going to carry on being the managing director for the foreseeable future. I still enjoy working in the business. I enjoy the team. I enjoy working with our clients. I'm passionate about the business. But it just means that if I want to start exploring other things in the future and I want to set up other businesses and do other things, I'm not then having to go to market, go through the sale process, think about my strategy. All of that is already in place. And now I can just focus on my role as the managing director on the other side of the transaction.
It's interesting, isn't it? When we started this podcast now 4 years ago, and we spoke about the concept there of intentional or circumstantial decision making. And here's a perfect example for me, which is very often succession comes from either a founder suddenly deciding, I've reached an age I want to retire, or even circumstances change, things change, health changes, lots of things change in business. And I've often seen succession be rushed and poor decisions made, and it may be the wrong person because the imperative is to get the succession in place. I think, again, we're sitting here, aren't we, saying that you took an intentional decision to say, I'm going to give up my ownership of the company to do now. I will then, over a period of time, decide what I put into the company, how long I stay, as you said, managing director, which you are doing for the foreseeable future. But it just allows that, again, that time to reflect on something, maybe to also to look at circumstances that could change over the next few years that we didn't see at the start. So I think it's a perfect example of that intentional decision making, rather than getting to a point where everything has to happen at the same time.
Yeah, and I think the way that people's careers have changed is very different from how it used to be. And that's the same for business owners as well. You know, my dad left school at 16. He's 76 now. He's been plasterer for 60 years. Now you see so many people not just jumping around jobs, but jumping around very completely different careers, or they might have 2 or 3 careers, and they might have 2 or 3, or they might have 2 or 3 businesses. So the way that we do business and do careers now has changed massively. And I think that's part of the reason that this appeals to me and to some others as well. It's they want to have that option to be able to have more variety in their life, and to also sort of reduce that grieving period a bit of, had a business on Friday and then I sold it on the Monday, and then I had to find something new to do because I was left without. I'm not in that position. I'm 4 days a week now. I'll reduce it to 3 days at some point. I will transition the business out, and I will find other ways to keep me motivated and fulfilled via other things. So it's a very organic process, as opposed to business was yours, now it's not yours, now you need to do something new 5 days a week. So it gives me a lot of flexibility.
I think, we know that from speaking with other guests on the podcast, and people we know have gone through this. It is that point of fulfillment, that position of, you remain the managing director. Yes, you remain the founder, you are no longer the owner, but ostensibly the fulfillment reason to be the why, if we use the Simon Sinek's why, the why still exists, which is, again, something which we've seen lots of people really struggle with when they do an absolute exit. So we're talking here about the decision you took and the change for yourself and for me and others that were shareholders. Let's talk about the mappers. Let's talk about the team and the employees. What, if anything, changes for them with this?
Yeah, so operationally, nothing really. I went into this very intentional that I didn't want to feel like I had to sell it to the team, because in reality, they've all got the same employment contracts. They've all got the same roles. They're all doing exactly the same thing. There's just a different owner of the business, which, yes, it's a bit odd that it happens to be a trust that they are the beneficiaries of, but they don't become shareholders. Nothing changes. They don't have to sign anything. We appoint trustees, which we can talk about shortly. Usually that involves at least one employee representative as a trustee, but the rest of the beneficiaries will either say, great, I'll crack on. Sounds interesting, but I don't intend to be here in X number of years when the founders have been paid off, so I'm not going to benefit from it anyway, but they're certainly not going backwards. Or they say, fantastic, this sounds really good. I hope to be here for the long term, and this has made me a little bit more motivated to be able to drive the success of the business forward. And the reason why I try to articulate it in that way is because I think I worry that some people jump into this and they see it as a sticking plaster. So the idea of building culture and building a business that's resilient and not dependent on the owner, that has to be in place pre-transaction. The transaction, the actual execution of the exchange of the contracts and the passing over of the shares to the trust, that has to be almost the last step. You can't use the sticking plaster to say, well, we've got very poor culture, people are not very motivated, so we're going to give them the business, we're going to make it employee owned and tell them how everything's going to change overnight. That really doesn't work. Yeah. And if that happens, the founder's going to be really frustrated post transaction because the company probably won't perform as well and they won't get paid. And the employees are frustrated because they feel like you've tried to pull the wool over their eyes with like this clever move. So employee ownership suits a certain type of business that has a certain type of culture. The culture can't be created post-transaction, is my view.
I also think it's probably worth at this point just sort of reiterating the point of, as you say, we've seen, let's use your phrase, advocates. I'd probably use a less friendly phrase. We've seen people sell, very often, lots of times sell transactional services in the M&A space, and they'll find something that's fashionable at the minute and they'll glitz it up. So, and they'll talk about, the fact that this is a way for essentially employees to get a share of the profits in the same way previously shares became dividends, but they're not shareholders. I think the big misunderstanding is also having a say. I think, as you said, it absolutely matters that your culture is right before you do this. And I don't believe, I know of employment ownerships that's gone through where the culture wasn't as strong as it could have been. And that does put pressure on, because also you get to that point of what you don't want is 36 shop stewards that suddenly think they've got I always joke about the whether it's cheese and onion or salt and vinegar in the vending machine, but there suddenly becomes a point that says this is what it does mean, this is what it doesn't mean. So it's also, I think it's worth just explaining that a little bit, Paul. Where are the discussion lines? From the employee's perspective, what kind of say do they get? What kind of vote do they get, if any?
Yeah. Again, I think one of the headlines that's not very helpful is when they say that an employee-owned business is run for the benefit of the employees, because although that essentially is true, when you say for the employees, that starts to sound very operational. And we got a lot of these questions from our team. This is not, if they now want PG tips in the kitchen instead of Tetley's, they vote by the feet and they get every decision. We want to move from this piece of software to this software. It's not that. When I said before about the two hats, I still wear the hat of leading the business. So myself and Amanda, as the directors of the business, are responsible for formulating a strategy and making those decisions. What it should really say is run for the benefit of shareholders. But exactly, that's actually all it was before. It's just that the shareholders were different people. So it's still run for the benefit of the shareholders. You could say for the benefit of the trust, which is the shareholder. But all that means is you should not be lining your own pockets anymore, which, by the way, you're perfectly entitled to do when it's your business. You can be more aggressive with your tax planning, the way that you structure your pay and the role that you have in the business and how much you work and all those sorts of things. But now you've got more governance. So the trustees are there to make sure the business is being governed properly and it's run in a way that hopefully is going to pay off the former shareholders and start to pay the new shareholders. So that's the role of the trust, is to govern the leadership. So the trustees can fire the directors if they want. They can fire the trading board, but they can't tell the trading board day to day what to do. But I'll just calm things down when I say fire, because you're still protected by employment rights and all that. They can't just decide they don't like you one day. But it just means that if a director was no longer acting ethically or no longer acting in the best interest of the business, and they were self-serving and using the business as their own piggy bank, which they may or may not have done before, then the trustees can step in and do something about that.
But it's interesting, Paul, because that, we've had these conversations about governance before. That is the reality for most businesses. It's only that we represent a space where the majority of our clients are owner operators. They do wear the hats, as you say. They are the shareholder and they are the director. And therefore, it's always sometimes difficult. We've said this before, that when you're making those decisions, are you making this decision as a shareholder? Are you making it director of the business? And very often what this does is it will now give a higher level of accountability to yourself and Amanda, because all you're doing is giving that ownership to a third party. Whereas very often in the small business environment, that third party is another individual, or it's the same as having multiple boards in large organizations. And sometimes if you work in a in a public company, you rarely get to meet the shareholders. I suppose it's going back to the basics of what the role of directors and directors' duties are, which I always think is a good thing.
Yeah, and by the way, I am one of the trustees as well. So I want me and Amanda and I need me and Amanda to lead the business properly for my own benefit as well as the rest of the team. So it's very much a collaborative effort. I know sometimes that sounds a little bit cheesy. Let's all hold hands and dance around and put pictures on social media of us. We all now have vested interest in the company, but it is a collaborative approach. Everybody wants the vendors to be paid off and the beneficiaries to start getting paid. So we're all on the same page. It's just the day-to-day running of the business needs to be left to the leadership team. It is not decision by committee.
The other thing that this does here is, doesn't it, just and we need to remind people this is also a longer term play. So you mentioned two things there, which is the potential upside for the employees comes at a time when, I'm going to use the phrase indebtedness to the vendors is paid off. And that will depend on, every business will have a different plan that supports that. I do know of some that have used raising of finance to speed that up. That's a choice for everyone to take. But I think the other thing to be really important here for other business owners to consider, this is not, cash day one. Now, we know, fewer and fewer transactions these days are all cash day one. There's often cash on completion and then anniversary style or completion accounts payments that we don't need to go into that level of detail today. But it's important for people to recognize this is I would say, a longer term play than a traditional exit. And that suits for people of your age. It might be more suitable than if it was myself. But also the bigger point, I suppose, you said there is that there's a potentially, and I'm going to use the word potentially, a greater element of risk. There will be people who will look at this and say, so these future payments are not guaranteed. They're not guaranteed. I'm not getting paid on the 31st of January each year as in previous sort of transactions, but it could take longer. There's a plan. Everyone will have a plan. We have a plan for ours. Other businesses will have their own plans. We have an expectation for that, but there's no guarantee. But it's also the same thing, which is I suppose the alignment of the goals is, it's in the trustees' interests to pay off as fast as possible if they want to then start to give out bonuses, etc. So just explain for people listening, how does that work? At what point is it a balance remaining? Is it a zero balance? At what point does a potential trustee be able to sit there and say, good news, ladies and gents, we've got a performance bonus this year to share?
It depends what you build into the contracts when you basically, you do your shareholders agreement, articles of association, trust deed, governance agreement. There's a number of contracts that go in place that will basically dictate those things. So you agree as much of that as you can pre-transaction to make it easy for everybody to follow a method. But if you're referring to the tax-free bonuses or sharing in the profits of the business, you could potentially do that from day one. So there's a liability from the trust to pay the vendors. You could sacrifice some of the profits to start to pay the employees, but usually and fairly, the shareholders want to be paid first because they've just given up the shares in their company and now they're getting drip fed, usually for a number of years, to pay for something that they've already lost. Equitably, it makes sense for the shareholders to be paid down first before you share that with employees. But if you wanted to, you could put something in place that means that you start to pay something to the employee sooner, or you could just decide that, the board could decide that that's how some of the future profits are going to be used. But yeah, you're right. Essentially, all of your consideration is conditional, and it is a conditional on future performance. If you sell to a third party, some of it might be unconditional, which means regardless of what happens in the future, they legally owe you that money on a certain date. And they have to find the cash. That's not your problem. They have to go and find debt or whatever else to pay you. With an EOT, that's not the case. You are not burdening the business with debt. The business has to make profit to pay you, and only once it's made enough profit to pay you will you get paid. So you're not putting the business at undue financial pressure, and you can put metrics in there and things to make sure that it preserves enough cash for working capital and other things as well.
Again, I think that's ironically how lots of larger organizations work anyway. There are budgets, there are rules on, previously as the MD, you were free. It wasn't your style, Paul, but you were technically free to make purchasing decisions. Majority shareholder, MD, we're gonna paint the office pink. It doesn't matter. We're gonna spend all this money. We're gonna have a big Christmas party, as lots of people do. Whereas now, I think it's probably worth just going through the point of governance. There are rules in place that says this is what the trading company can and can't do. This is the points at which, as you would in a large organisation, this is the point at which approval is required from others. In our instance, trustees. At that point, again, and it's important that we talk in principles, because what's right for us and our team might not be right for others. But explain now then on some loose areas, how is the company now governed?
So there is a board. There's a trading board. So the registered directors of the MAP Accountants Limited, the trading entity, that's the board that is responsible for running the company, running the trading entity. There's then directors of the trustee entity, which owns the shareholders of MAP, and that has trustees that are registered directors of that limited company. Now, you need to ensure that when you transact an EOT, we can go through the process shortly in terms of the legal process and the tax process, but one of the criteria is that you must show that you're relinquishing control as the shareholder. So you cannot be the majority, making the majority decisions from a trustee perspective and governing yourself. So you need to make sure that at least 50% of the trustees are non-vendors, so not previous shareholders. We decided to make that 66.66%. So I'm one of the trustees, and then 2 of the employees are trustees. Often it's the case where you might decide to have an independent trustee instead. I decided not to. Obviously, we're very fortunate. We're a professional service firm. We've got lots of very professional, well-qualified people who feel comfortable being trustees. But if that's not the case, you could decide to have an independent trustee. So then in that situation, with 3 people, the vendor can be outvoted on decisions because the 2 employee representatives could pass an ordinary resolution because they've got 67%, or myself as the vendor and one of the trustees could pass a vote as well. So I think having that 3 definitely puts that governance in place. We had additional requirements with how we're governed by ACCA as our accounting professional body. Others might have requirements about how they are governed. So we needed at least 50% of the trading entity to be ACCA qualified accountants, which we tick that box because Amanda's not, but I am. And then all 3 of us are on the trustee board as well. So yeah, in summary, the trustee board governs the trading board, and the trustee and the trustee board needs to be not controlled by any of the vendors that have sold their shares to the trust.
I suppose that's one point, isn't it, to, again, for anybody listening that has an interest in this, maybe check, as you say, your own industry. So obviously professional services, you would expect there to be another level of governance. So as you say, ours happens to be ACCA. I'd imagine it's the same probably in the legal sector, but I don't know that. And there might be things in there for people to understand. So what you're saying is essentially the founder, the majority vendor becomes one of the trustees, and you need to appoint at least one more. For our own reasons, we've done more than that. And that is around about governance, really. Help me understand, I suppose, on a more basic level, Paul, why was an EOT the right thing for Paul Barnes? Why was it a right thing for MAP? And the big question, why now? Because, I'm aware, obviously, of our conversations. I would imagine there are a number of transactions that either halted or will never happen following the October budget. So I think it's an important one to explain why an EOT and why now.
Okay. So every business owner has to exit the business at some point, whether that's during life or sadly in death. So what we look to help our clients to do is to exit the business on their own terms, and their own terms are different. Every business is unique. Every business owner's circumstances are unique. I'm still relatively young. but I wanted to be able to explore other things as well as Matt. As I said before, I didn't feel that it was appropriate for me to do that whilst being the majority shareholder and manager director of the business. So I was then left with the option as, do I sell to a third party or do I sell to the team? And selling to the team can be through an employee ownership trust, or it can be an MBO. If I had a different mindset, which some clients will, which might be about maximizing their commercial return, an EOT on paper is not the most lucrative way to exit a business. As we said before, it's going to take me many years to get paid out because I've got to wait for the business to make the money to pay me. And that's not usually the case in a third-party transaction. And usually you'd get paid more of a premium. We can come on to the valuation shortly of employee ownership. But for me, it was more important to get a fair deal, not the best deal in terms of financially, and to be able to preserve the legacy and culture that I'm very proud to have built. I was trying to stargaze into the future and think, when I look back, how am I going to feel if I've cashed out, sold to a third party, and the culture is not the same? I felt very privileged and very proud to have the culture that we've got at MAP. So the biggest threat to my happiness, if you like, was that being undone for me to make a quick buck. I'm very fortunate. This is the second business that I've sold. Sold a software business in 2021, which gave me a level of financial independence. So I didn't need to squeeze every last penny out of this transaction. And as I said before, I felt when you read all of the stuff and you speak to other people about what a successful employee-owned businesses or employee-owned ripe business looks like, I'm not going to say we're perfect and we ticked all of the boxes, but we certainly tick a lot of them in terms of the way that the employees conduct themselves, the way that they talk about the business and embody the values of the business. It takes a long time to build that up, and I count my lucky stars that we've got people that fit the values that I fit, and I there feel a lot more confident that that legacy will continue without me being there if it stays independent and becomes employee owned rather than gets taken over by a third party.
It's, again, I find the whole thing about culture, as you know, fascinating, because I'll say it again for the record, the difference between those organisations that I've been involved in that met their expectations or exceeded their expectations was down to the right culture or the wrong culture. And the point that we often see is, you can sit here and look at, we know of some very strong acquirers who will say, oh, you can come in, we'll leave you alone, we'll let you grow your own business. We know in the main that doesn't work. And that's sort of the obvious one. So Paul exits left and after being sold to accounting group ABC or whatever. But the one that I've seen affect companies greater is when all the things that get done normally change. So a larger organization will often centralize HR. So recruitment, we believe in values-based interviews. I would be surprised if that would have carried on had it been a third-party transaction. And they're one of the things that we can sit here today and say, you are very proud of what you've achieved. You're very proud. And the team that we've got, we always say this, that they are the right people. Whilst they're not all the same, they're different. They share a set of values. But if that suddenly was to change and recruitment was being done in Amsterdam, for example, then suddenly you'd be getting very different people join the business. And that's one of the areas that I've seen personally, culture get radically changed. And the founder sitting there saying, hang on a minute, this is, I thought a lot of this was going to stay as was, and it simply doesn't. And that would lead to, as you say, that sense of loss and that sense of grieving. Those of us who've sold businesses and those of us that are honest enough to say this, it's not all the glitz and glamour. There is that sense of, you and I have had this conversation recently, Paul. You've been honest and said, yeah, I've had to work through those points for myself. But you can still take pride in the fact that the culture you've built, there is going to be less obstacles to that culture under an EOT, in my belief, than there would have been had it been independent.
Significantly, yeah. Like, change is always really hard, isn't it? And if you found two businesses that are very closely aligned and matched values, it'll still be really, really hard, because even the things that employees take seriously to them, they might look small and material from the outside, but understandably, an acquiring company needs an element of consistency and control over the way that things are run. So there's always going to be change, and therefore the way that most humans work is that they perceive change to be bad. And as frustrating as that can be for an entrepreneur and a business owner, that is just reality. And however much you try to sell it to them or you try to soften it, for most people who are already happy in their role, they would see that as risk and negativity and slowing them down and frustration. So I was lucky that I didn't need to bite that bullet to do all of that. But as I said before, I'm not just selling employee ownership. There are other business owners who quite rightfully want to maximize the value they can get for themselves and their family. They found a third party buyer who's ready to dance with them and talk about a deal. They might like what life looks like on the other side for them and the role that they play within that group. The employees might even like it because it might be another company that they look up to. They might get more opportunities. They might get better remuneration. There are plenty of advantages of a third party sale as well. But when I did my thinking and my reflecting, I anticipated that there's a greater risk of regret of putting the culture at risk than there would be the regret of not maximising my return.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And what do you see change for yourself, Paul? So yourself and Amanda remain as the company officers. You're remaining as MD. You're going to have some time to adjust to changed circumstances. What do you hope to see change? What's in the positive section? And to use your double bookkeeping point, what's in the negative ledger?
So as I said before, really, I don't anticipate lots of change in the short term. I see this more as formalising what was already happening. So don't fall off your chair, but I wasn't working 9 till 5 days a week before, and I'm not going to now.
Is your break got any better?
Slightly, not enough. So I don't see this as a big change genuinely in how I conduct myself and the role that I play, the hours that I work, the lifestyle that I live. And that's why I thought employee ownership was well suited to this, because it's a very organic change. So rather than this be a carrot to the team or a motivator to the team, as I said before, putting a sticking plaster on, it's reward rather than incentive. It's rewarding how the team already operate. It's almost like I've tested them over all these years is, do they truly care? And do they truly put all their all? And I've got enough evidence now to suggest that they do. And so not a lot needs to change, and not a lot needs to change for me because I'm not unhappy. I still enjoy it. It just means that as and when I would like to start introducing my successor into the business, I can do it slowly. I can do it properly. I can enjoy that process and it be relatively low stress. I can make small mistakes and, take my time to get that right. And then it can be very organic and collaborative. So I can start to reduce my time as somebody else comes in and starts to increase theirs.
It's that thing of collaboration you just said there, Paul, for me, which is very often, whether it's a third party acquirer or other forms of succession. So new MD comes in, and very often in my experience, and by the way, I'm the idiot who's done this, so that's why I say in my experience, often too keen to make a change. When I was a young MD, I felt it was my responsibility to make these decisions, and foolish enough sometimes think a bad decision is better than no decision, but it's important to demonstrate change. This way, as you say, that can be done over a period of time in a far more collaborative nature than anybody saying, right, here you go, here's the keys, enjoy it, off you go, and don't bother me tomorrow. And that's the bit that I think is going to be really interesting. And I also think that's great for the team because you are very humble as a founder. You don't have that founder's ego that we see in some organisations. But for me, the team still do look up to you massively, Paul. And that was evidenced, by the way, in some of the questions. The questions in our transaction, for anybody listening, were about what's Paul going to be doing? What does that mean for Paul? A, because they're interested, but also for themselves. But the fact that we're not sitting there now saying, hey, guys, come and meet Frederick. Frederick's the new MD on Monday. It suddenly makes that whole thing, as you say, change. Change very often is perceived as well, it's always perceived as negative and sometimes it isn't, but it's also allowing everybody to do it at a pace that's ironically, it's going to be optimized, isn't it? It's going to be done at the right pace for the business as and when these opportunities and there will be issues occur.
Yeah. And when you asked me the question about what does change for me, obviously there has to be some change. Otherwise, why have I done it? It's not going to be exactly the same. But when I say about formalizing it, one of the advantages for me is now I can start to look at other things. You always gave me a brilliant bit of advice is if you're walking away from something, make sure you're walking towards something else, because otherwise that can be really difficult that you've just given up one thing and you've not got something to be excited about. So I'm very mindful of that. But again, going back to what I said before, I was already doing that before. I was already starting to explore other businesses, other things that excite me, other ventures. And all this has done is given me permission to do that. I now take Wednesdays off. So I can use my Wednesday as time off, but I can also use it as time to think and time to be an entrepreneur, and almost give me that platform and that space to say, I don't need to be guilty now that I'm not working on my business because I've done this transaction to formalize that being a thing, and I can start to explore things, which is what I'm excited about. And as I say, I think that's part of the reason, consciously or subconsciously, that other business owners get attracted to this, because they no longer see the world as I have one business or one career. They want to explore other opportunities. And by the way, some of those things might take years to bear fruit or to come to the surface. And I might have lots of really bad ideas before I land on something. But it just gives me that that ammunition and that right to be able to explore those things, because it's not, why is Paul not working today on Matt? That's my day now to do my thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Paul. I mean, I think that says a lot about you and your personality and your integrity to that, to want to formalise it to that manner. Let's talk about the sort of transaction, which is explain to people the sort of legal process. So very often in a third-party transaction, there's two sides, two due diligence. But go back on, obviously, you made some decisions to get HMRC clearance, etc. Explain that to people of what the difference between doing that and not doing that means, and therefore what we then had to complete.
First step is to do a valuation. So you need to do an independent valuation. That's really important, because otherwise HMRC are likely to, and rightly so, inquire and dig into your valuation. So you should get a third party to do it. And that is really important, because as well as being morally right, to be valuing your business at the right level, because the future business is going to pay for it. HMRC were to decide in the next step I'm going to come on to, or at any point in the future, that you've overvalued that business, then all of that capital gains tax relief can be withdrawn. So you need to get an independent party to do a valuation on your business. Don't forget, you could reject it. You could look at it and say, actually, I thought it was going to be worth more than that. I now no longer want to do this. And you can even challenge the independent valuation as well, and share some reasons why you think they should consider driving the valuation up for different factors. But ultimately, it needs to be an independent person who is using their professional experience to put a valuation on the business. So there's two parts to that. One is looking at the historical performance of the business. And, for a service business like us, it's typically an amalgamation of a revenue valuation and a multiple of EBITDA. But then crucially, HMRC wants evidence that valuation is repayable over a reasonable period. So typically that's something like 5 to 7 years. If you can't evidence a forecast that suggests that these founders are going to get paid off in the next 5 to 7 years, then it feels like you've probably overvalued this business. And that's hard to do with the EBITDA to a degree, because it's more factual, but there are some adjusting items in there that are subjective, but it's easy to do with the multiple. So if you've happened to have omitted some data and some research to put the multiple up, but now you can't evidence it's going to be paid in the next 5 to 7 years, then HMRC are going to see through it and they're going to veto it.
So what we're saying here is, in the same way that, and again, people are often misguided, for people who've gone through due diligence for third party, very often due diligence is a discounting exercise, and they're seeking to find issues maybe with your trading history or anything to attack your price. What we're saying here is, it's so rather than, again, some of the PR stories or some of the sales stories around, as a founder, you can create your own valuation. It's an independent person creating that valuation, and almost the due diligence on that is ironically done by HMRC. That's the interesting part, to say this is a fair and reasonable valuation. It is a sustainable business and it's going to be paid back in a certain amount of time.
So that's part of the tax clearance. So the advisor will send a PAT over to HMRC that includes the valuation, but it'll also include some of the mechanics that we talked about before. So your evidence that the passing of control by the way that the trustee entity has been set up on behalf of the beneficiaries, who the trustees are going to be, all of that structure is shared along with the valuation. And that's what HMRC are giving clearance on, that this appears to be a bona fide transaction, that on the face of it, we're happy to give you the rubber stamp. However, in the coming years, if we decide to inquire and we can see that you've tried to pull the wool over our eyes, or you've not executed this as you suggested in the clearance, then you're not out of the woods.
And in terms of, I know the process we followed, and we followed it for our own governance and due diligence. So we have, as we do with any period in the business, we have a forecast we're working to, and we have a multi-year plan that we're working to. Is it standard, therefore, for that to be submitted to HMRC as well? Do HMRC look at your forecast, your plan in the same way that maybe an acquirer would and say, okay, we can see where this valuation comes from and we can see this payback time?
Absolutely that, yeah. So you don't just tell them the outcome, you show them. The more workings you show them, like anything, the more you protect yourself.
Yeah.
Because you're exposing everything. You're showing that we've got nothing here to hide. Here's all of our calculations. Here's all of our research. We're laying it all out for you. It's much easier then for them to come back and say, do you know what? This is great. This is really professionally put together. Everything that needs to be considered has been considered. We've got no questions. And then when they come and ask in the future, this is going to be harder for them to challenge as well. So yeah, we showed a number of years model into the future with the predicted budget, which we've always done as a business anyway, multiple years into the future, with your support. And then it will show within that budget now, the new line, if you like, is paying down the founders out of those profits into the future.
So that's the sort of precursor. So that's the bit that, if you're interested in this, you need to do for yourself. You need to get the independent valuation done. And then that's your sign or your flag as the owner to go, hey, that's in line with my expectations, or it's not in line, then to proceed. So the actual legal process is slightly shortened, is it, and slightly simpler. So explain for anybody listening roughly where that legal process goes.
Yeah, so next, once the clearances come in, you would normally instruct solicitors. You don't want to do it before then because you're wasting money on something that you may never go ahead with. So start paying solicitors once you've got that green light from HMRC. They then would typically set up the trust and help you set up the trustee board. They would then take you through to the share purchase agreement. So just like a third party sale, there's still a share purchase agreement between the existing shareholders and the trust. Make sure that everything is covered. You know, there's typical templates and best practice around what would make its way into a share purchase agreement for an EOT versus another transaction. And then the trust deed and the governance agreement, which basically lays out, as well as the articles, how the structure is going to work and how it's going to be executed in practice. So that involves both updating the company's house documents for the trading entity to make sure everything there is appropriate for the employee ownership, and then the trustee entity that usually gets set up as well.
Okay. Having gone through, first time I've done an EOT, but having gone through third-party transactions and an EOT, you know, I was pleasantly surprised to see it is a much more simple process, a little bit more straightforward, because what you don't have is the adversarial side very often in two legal practices looking to outdo each other. I suppose one thing that maybe a final question is, how permanent is this? So you've given up control, we've given up control, that's permanent. But the business is still owned by, just happens to be a trust. Does it say it has to always be owned by a trust? Does that trust and the trustees have a right in, whether that's, let's just say, 50 years from now? Is MAP always going to be owned by a trustee, by a trust, or can it be sold in the future?
It's very rare that they are sold, or it always has been rare, but it has happened. So it is legally permissible for an entity owned by an employee ownership trust to be sold. The trustees ultimately make that decision because they are acting on behalf of the shareholders, the beneficiaries. There is a thing that you can do as a founder called a letter of wishes. So you can do a letter that says, even though I'm no longer in control of this and this is not my decision, as the founder of this business, these are some things that I would like you to bear in mind in terms of my wishes. So you could put in there that I would always like this business to be owned on behalf of its employees and to never be sold. But the reality is the trustees could decide that it's in the best interest of the beneficiaries. That's ultimately what they need to do. It's not just what's in their best interest as trustees. It's about the employees, the beneficiaries overall, that they're going to sell the business. So that it is possible, and it has happened and will happen again, where the trust can sell that entity.
I think, like everything, Paul, time will tell, won't it? So, these things have been around for a long time, but maybe not the sort of length of time that is someone's career. So today we have a pretty young and vibrant team, but at some point they'll all be old duffers like me, and that might change. So I think we'll see trusts work whilst the beneficiaries, I suppose, have an identity in their own right. The day that the last beneficiary today under MAP leaves and the team are all newbies, maybe that's the kind of thing where we'll see more changes of this in 10 to 15 years to come within our own industry or with the sector we represent. It'll be fascinating.
Yeah.
I suppose, really, to close, Paul, I will always say to anybody listening, if this has resonated, how do they find our guest? Well, obviously, people know how to find you. If somebody is interested in understanding more about this, even if it's just help me understand in a little bit more detail, Paul, what you went through, what it meant for you, what do MAP offer? How is Paul available to help people understand whether, as we said at the start of this, whether an EOT is the right option for another business owner?
Yeah, so you've hit the nail on the head. It's about what's right for the business owner. So we're not suddenly, we've been employee owned. It's the best thing since sliced bread. Everybody should be doing it. It was appropriate for me. It's what I decided to do for my business. We take the time to not just listen to what a business owner wants, but to actually challenge what they want. Not every business owner, in fact, majority of business owners are not clear on certainly what their vehicle is. They might be clear on some things they want from life in terms of other opportunities they want to explore, what fulfills them, maybe their working time, what annoys them, how much money they need potentially. But even if they knew all that, it doesn't mean that they know what their exit vehicle is. So we take the time to listen, to challenge, to show different options, to model those different options. And then sometimes once you've got an element of clarity, so for example, a client that I'm working with on this now through MAP, quite clear that they don't want to sell to a third party. They don't know whether it's an EOT or MBO. And what I concluded is, I'm not sure it matters too much at this stage. He's talking about exiting in 5 years' time. So actually, most of the things you'll do to exit in 5 years' time to an MBO are very similar to an EOT. So we can model them both, and then we can just sort of crack on with helping the business to be ready for an MBO or an EOT in 5 years' time. So it is customized. We can do workshops, we can do valuations, we can do models to see what it might look like. But fundamentally, then the way that that's delivered depends where the business owner is in their journey, how much clarity they've got, how much they need challenge versus execution. So a client could come to us and say, don't want to exit in the next 10 years, but want to start the conversation now as to what that might look like. That's one extreme. The other extreme was, I want to sell my business and I want to market to it I want to put it on the market for a third party buyer. Can you help me to execute? So we can help across that whole spectrum really of exit planning and M&A execution. So if of interest, obviously send me an email, paul@wearemap.co.uk, or drop me a message on LinkedIn.
I think the important thing, Paul, is the basics don't change, do they? So you've told enough people, if you want to have an exit on your own terms, then build a business that can deliver without you.
Mm-hmm.
So you've done that. It then puts you in that mindset to say what are the options available. I think the important thing for everyone who is listening is understand it's just another option. So we're never going to say blue, 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 no, suddenly it's red. We're just saying, look, this is another option that, having gone through it for ourselves, we can now give people that detail on. And we're saying we've done it with some clients, but I think it's important to go through the transaction for yourself. But it is, all the basics remain the same. It's not sticking plaster, to use your phrase. If your culture's right, the things that make somebody want your business should be the same things that you work hard to deliver, even if it's for yourself to do this. Because had you sought an external sale, all those things would have just as equally mattered. Yes, this is what was better for yourself, and integrity of the vision, integrity of the culture, succession, all those things. But all those things remain. If you're selling to a third party and you want the best valuation, all those things matter. So these things don't change. It's about getting yourself in the right position. As I say, whether this is an option for you or not, it's an option that everyone should understand, because I don't think you can discount things out, or you can rule things in or out until you fully understand them.
Yeah.
But don't just follow the trend. Yes, they've become very popular. Don't follow the trend. Don't follow the headlines.
Obviously, I'm biased about MAP, but I think two of the things that stand out versus using an M&A advisor is, one, they're going to probably try and take you down to a certain route. So whether you're ready to sell a business or not, they make their money from you selling the business. They're not ready to sit and listen and put a time frame in place and even challenge you and tell you, we don't think you should sell your business.
Yeah.
There's loads of ways of extracting value and fulfillment from your business for many, many years that don't involve you selling any of your business.
Yeah.
So there's that side of it as well. Fundamentally, we are a partner to our clients. And because of that, the second advantage is that we already have loads of the financial information. So we can actually pull a lot of that information from existing records and existing history about that client. So we can have a much, I think, more open-minded, caring conversation versus somebody who makes their money on you selling your business.
I think that's been the case for a long time, but I think it's an important thing to understand. As you say, there are a number of, to use your phrase, advocates at the moment that will say whatever the flavour of the month is the best thing since sliced bread, and that's not always the case. And I think what you've done today, Paul, is help people understand that it was as much a personal thing for you. It was about what you've done. It was recognising what you've built and not having to give away quickly, which we've seen other people do. Yes, also being respectful of the point that, you have succeeded in a previous transaction, and that changes for lots of people the need to do things. But more importantly, the fact is also you're taking a long-term view on it. So I hope it's been useful. As I say, it's something that's been very popular recently, but I thought, having gone through it just recently and gone through it ourselves, it was a very worthwhile conversation. So I hope it's been of use, and thanks for joining us again in the Map Room, and I hope we'll see you again soon. Thanks. Bye for now.